Good afternoon and welcome to this fourth session of our study of the minor prophets. I'm looking forward to sharing the rest of these with you, and they get to be, as we mentioned in the very first introduction, they get to be almost boring because they say the same thing over and over, but we try to put a little bit of excitement in, at least by giving you information about them. What I want you to do is, more than anything else, is to understand who they are and why these books have been written. Today we're going to look at the book of Amos. Probably, like the rest of the minor prophets, a bit forgotten as far as a book is concerned. We don't hear too many sermons preached from the book of Amos. We certainly don't see it read in church very much. And I suspect that many of us do not know a whole lot about the book of Amos. But that's where we're going to go today. It's a difficult book to read. As I read through in preparation for this study, it came to my mind that this is very difficult reading because you understand what's about to happen. It's singularly a book of absolute condemnation and divine judgment. If you're seeking a feel-good book to read in the Bible, I can tell you now, Amos is not the book. It's not a feel-good book. Amos is, however, one of the earliest of the prophets. He appeared during the time when Assyria was the greatest world power, and he was kind of a contemporary with Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah. But he was the earliest of those four prophets. Now, the purpose of his book was to proclaim God's judgment on the kingdom of Israel. Now, remember that at this particular time, Israel was divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. He called them to cease their disobedience, and he encouraged them to repent of their self-righteous sins and their faithless idolatry. To declare this message, God called Amos probably, I think I could say, one of the most unexpected characters God could have chosen to deliver his message. Amos had no ministry background, and he certainly did not possess any prophetic experience. He didn't come from a line of prophets, nor was he a prophetic mind. He was a simple herdsman. He shepherded sheep, and he dressed sycamore fig trees for a living. When he suddenly one day received this call from God. Now that call can be found in chapter 7, verse 15, where Amos writes, "But the Lord took me from following the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" So here's a man who's out tending his flock, innocently just watching his sheep, and all of a sudden God calls him to be a prophet. Now, we don't know much about Amos personally. What we know comes from his book. He was born in Tekoa, which is a little town located in the high country north of Bethlehem and south of Jerusalem. It overlooked the wilderness of Judah. It was a place absolutely perfect for shepherding flocks and herds, so he was in the right place at the right time. But he was also a dresser of sycamore fig trees. Now we know that he prophesied, or let me put it this way, we're fairly confident that he prophesied during the latter half of Jeroboam's reign and during an era when the kingdoms of Israel were divided, but it was also during an age when they were characterized by more abundant prosperity. They were prospering nations. They were more prosperous than they had ever experienced, especially the northern kingdom under Jeroboam II. Now, in chapter 1, verse 1, we read, helps us pinpoint the time that Amos actually ministered. It says 2 years before the earthquake. Now we know from Zechariah 14:5 and also from the ancient Jewish historian Josephus that an earthquake of fairly significant magnitude occurred in the year 755 BCE. Now, with these historical markers, we can actually place Amos historically during the reigns of Uzziah, who was the king of Judah, and Jeroboam, who was the son of Jehoash that we talked about last week, the king of Israel, or sometime in the neighborhood of 760 to 755 BCE. That would be a good place to put his ministry time. Now, Amos prophesied principally to Israel for being disobedient to God's laws, but he also prophesied against the nations that were around Israel. He focused his message against the major cities in the northern kingdom, and that was pretty brassy of him, quite frankly. He didn't go to the little towns and burgs of Israel to do his prophesying. He absolutely had the gall to go to the major cities. For example, he dared to prophesy at the great cult center of Bethel. Now, Bethel was a city that had achieved a great deal of prominence for its worship of idols. It was also the place where King Jeroboam himself resided. He had a palace in Bethel. So, boy, it took some courage for Amos to go to the city of Bethel and deliver his message. He bravely prophesied in Samaria. Now, Samaria is the capital city of Israel. I mean, these cities were inordinately prosperous. They had grown over time, partly because they were on major trade routes that crossed that area. He even prophesied that the Israelites would ultimately be conquered by the Assyrians and removed from their homeland. If I were an Israelite, I wouldn't want to hear that. That took a lot of bravery for him to deliver a message that says, hey, you ain't going to be here much longer. You're going to be taken into captivity, and you're going to be enslaved. That's essentially what he's saying. Now, the purpose of Amos's prophecy was to awaken Israel. He wanted to awaken Israel and the surrounding nations to the fact that the nation needed to be responsible and accountable for its sins. So the purpose of his message is really twofold. There are two purposes that he wanted to address, or two fundamental sins in Israel that he wanted to address. The first was an absence of true worship. They were not truly worshiping. And the second was a lack of justice. These were keys to the problems in Israel, the spiritual problems in Israel. They had no material problems. They were wealthy and they were prosperous, but they had spiritual problems. In the midst of all of this unprecedented fortune that Israel had now come into, God's people were offering worship form without worship substance. Now, I want us to keep those words in mind because in many cases, I believe that's where we are today in many churches. We do wonderfully to worship in form. The bulletin looks good. The order of service is just right. We've got it right. We're going to keep it that way. Oh, you never want to change up the order of the service. That might mess up people's minds, especially if we're trying to get to their spirit. And that's the way it was with Israel. They had the form of worship down pat, but they had no substance to their worship. They had no feel to their worship, no spirit in their worship. And God didn't like that. They were declaring Yahweh with their mouths, but they were not pursuing the Lord with their hearts. Think about that just for a moment. Their apostasy, that's evidenced by their recurrent, deliberate rejection of the prophetic message of Amos, would ultimately result in divine judgment. But God's the God of His Word. And because He has established a covenant with His people, Yahweh will not abandon Israel altogether. Now, you not only need to keep that in mind here as we study Amos, or even the rest of these minor prophets, but keep that in mind since we studied Revelation, because God will not abandon Israel, but He will bring future restoration to a righteous remnant. You'll find that even here in Amos chapter 9, verses 7 through 15. He will bring restoration to a future remnant. Now, Amos is not one of the shorter books of the minor prophets, of course, but it does have an outline, and it can be outlined as follows. It has kind of an editorial introduction in the first two in chapters 1 and 2, and then it gives oracles against the nations, which also comprises a part of that. Then he gives a threefold summons to hear the word of the Lord. That's in chapters 3 through 5. Then he offers 3 woes that God issued to him in chapters 5 and 6. There are some symbolic visions in chapters 7 through 9, and then there's an epilogue in chapter 9, the last 5 verses of that chapter. Now, while we cannot take time to analyze every chapter verse by verse, we can take sort of a global look at each of the major outline points. This would, I think, be sufficient to offer a fairly good idea of the impact of Amos on the people of his day and even on us today. So let's look first at the oracles against the nation. Don't worry about the editorial part of it. We already know about that. That's just an introduction to Amos. Now, after that brief editorial introduction of Amos the man, the prophet begins to describe the offenses of the nation that shall bring judgment with the sound of a lion's roar. Does that sound familiar? Surely does. God speaks and delivers His message to Amos. He begins by condemning the residents of Damascus. These are people who had paganized the temples of Yahweh. They were selfishly placing their own welfare above that of others simply because of wealth. They wanted to gain wealth, and they would do anything, including step on the poor, to gain that wealth. They performed their rituals in form only. Oh, it was grandiose. There was wonderful pomp and circumstance as a part of their worship, but substance was lacking. Substance was lacking. They were disobedient and disrespectful to the very God who had so long blessed them. They ultimately were to be held captive because of that disobedience to God. Now, further in chapter 1, Amos foretells the fall of outlaw nations surrounding Israel, like, for example, Gaza and Tyre, as a result of their treatment of God's chosen people. He describes how Edom, for example, full of fighting spirit, full of anger, would suffer from a raging fire because of wars against their brothers. And the citadels of Ammon would be consumed by fire and wind as punishment for murdering pregnant women in Gilead. And when I think of that particular part of the story, I can't help but apply this judgment to modern day America for its continual murder of innocent young babies. Amos continues his litany of law violation by naming Moab in chapter 2 as yet another one of these outlaw neighboring nations, because it would appear that the king of Moab had the body of the Edomite king whom he had defeated. He had his body cremated, which, by the way, at that time was not necessarily an accepted practice. God, therefore, would rain fire on Moab and bring the nation to its knees. You don't do what God doesn't like. So then Amos, now that he's dealt with these rogue nations that surround Israel, he now turns his attention to Judah and Israel. For Judah's rejection of the law of Yahweh, because of Judah's faithless, idolatrous worship, and due to Judah's willingness to follow false prophets, judgment would ensue. That judgment ultimately was war with Nebuchadnezzar, the burning of Jerusalem, and then ultimately the destruction of the palace and even the temple. Those were the results of Judah's lack of willingness to follow Yahweh. But the most detailed judgment is declared against Israel. This nation whose judicial system was corrupt to the core, whose treatment of the down and out was unmercifully cruel, whose oppression of the weak in society was particularly severe, and whose licentious behavior, that immorality, was an abomination to the very nostrils of Yahweh, that people would now suffer the judgment of a righteous God. As all of this lawlessness and paganness ran rampant throughout Israel, the Lord promised that he would completely destroy Israel for her transgressions. Now let's keep that in mind as we get to the end of this. Remember that restoration. God has now said he's going to destroy Israel. That was his promise. That was his word. But then there's that threefold summons to hear the word of the Lord. We read that in chapters 3 and 5. Now the first summons comes from chapter 3, verse 1, where Amos writes, "Listen to this message that the Lord has spoken against you, Israelites, against the entire clan that I brought from the land of Egypt." And then Amos declares that the children of Israel have not fulfilled their responsibilities as God's chosen people. God had a purpose for them, and they chose not to live up to that purpose. They have not learned their lesson, for they've gained wealth at the expense of the poor. They live in the luxury of their plush houses, while at the same time the poor are allowed to languish in their poverty. They were no better than the nations that really were around them, who lived with these very same excesses and looked the other way when the poor appeared. Didn't want to have anything to do with them. So as a result, Amos announces that a misfortune will come, and it will be the indisputable work of Yahweh. The altars of Bethel will be destroyed. Israel will be conquered, and Israel will be exiled. The Egyptians and the Philistines are even invited here in Amos to go to the mountains, assemble in the mountains, and witness the punishment of Israel. Stand there and enjoy every single minute of Israel's punishment. Now the second summons comes in chapter 4, verse 1. Amos writes, "Listen to this message, you cows of Bashan, who are on the hill of Samaria, women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring us something to drink. You see, the Israelites were living so in the lap of luxury that Amos described their lucre-loving wives as cows. Hey, you cows of Bashan. These were women who had forgotten from whence they came. They only savored the perquisites of wealth. But God saw them for who they were. No justice, no mercy, no concern for the plight of the poor. And so to please God, they, at least what they thought would be pleasing God, they polished their shrines and their altars, yet their devotion to the Lord was lacking. They even resorted to some of the most bizarre acts of immorality, abuse, fornication, and drunkenness you could ever imagine. And that especially in their places of worship. How could they? God cannot and He will not. He could not and He would not tolerate their ways. And Amos came as God's spokesman to announce the coming wrath of God. Now that wrath would take several forms. First, they will be taken away with fish hooks. Chapter 4, verse 2. Now, you may wonder what this means. Well, it was common among the Assyrians to lead people when they would drive, almost like a cattle drive, when they would take people from one place to another. These, we're talking about slaves. They would put hooks in their lips. They would put hooks in their mouths through their lower lip, and they would lead them that way. Of course, any tugging would bring pain, severe pain. They didn't care. They didn't care. They didn't care if they died, just as long as they would do what they were told. So what Amos is saying is that, like the Assyrians carrying away their slaves with fish hooks in their mouths, so the Israelites will be taken away with fish hooks. Second, the sacrifices at Bethel and Gilgal will be worthless. Chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Number 3, rain will be withheld. Chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Number 4, there will be a lack of bread. Chapter 4, verse 6 and 5, Israel will suffer blight and mildew. Chapter 4, verse 9. It's nothing less than just judgment at every turn. Nowhere to go. Everywhere they look, God's judgment is there. Now, the third summons is found in chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. Amos writes, listen to this message that I am singing for you. A lament, house of Israel. She has fallen. Virgin Israel will never rise again. She lies abandoned on her land with no one to raise her up. And he writes some beautiful words in here. He says, the Lord who made Pleiades and Orion is the very same God who invites you to seek me and live. Seek me and live. But they're not to seek him in the stars in Gilgal. They're not to seek him in the skies of Bethel or Beersheba, where once their worship was glorious and powerful. But now their worship is vain and worthless. They need to seek God in the quiet place of his temple. Worship him, not just in form, but in substance. Then in chapters 5 and 6, Amos issues 3 woes that he receives from God. He declares these on the people of God. He writes first, woe, this is chapter 5, verse 18, woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Now, since Israel appears to have turned its back on Yahweh, this woe turns against those who have not loved the Lord their God. They are those who, in spite of knowing that they have been brought out of Egypt, that they have successfully traversed the wilderness, and they now prosper in these wonderful cities, yet they don't acknowledge that the source of all of that prosperity is God. Why would Israel wish for the day of the Lord? Well, after all, it's not unlike the day of the Lord of Revelation. And we know how that will end, don't we? Now, then Amos asks a couple of what I think are rhetorical questions when he says, is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? Gloom without brightness in it? You see, Israel was looking forward to the day of the Lord. They had listened to the description of the prophets and how the day of the Lord would be a day when God would defend his people and destroy his enemies. What a great and glorious day that would be. That's the day of the Lord that the Israelites sought. That's the day of the Lord for which they longed. In truth, however, you and I know, because we have hindsight, we know that the day of the Lord is a day of divine judgment. It is a day of divine judgment. It's a day when God will defend his people and his enemies may be destroyed, but rebellious Israel, covenant-breaking Israel, law-breaking Israel is headed for destruction. They've not only failed in worship and in their covenant relationship with Yahweh, but they've also failed in maintaining the ethical standards that were established by Yahweh. He had specific moral standards by which he wanted his people to live. They have failed in maintaining those moral and ethical standards. And Amos notes their shortcomings and how God no longer accepts their worship. He no longer accepts their sacrifices or offerings. He's simply tired of wasting his time on a people who no longer seem to care for him. Amos concludes this woe with words, that ring down through the ages. I especially like the King James version of this verse. So this is where I kind of jump from my old Greek New Testament, my free translation, to the King James. In chapter 5, verse 24, he says, let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. Now the second woe addresses the wealthy in Zion and Samaria, chapter 6, verse 1. The first woe focused on the fundamental issue for the 2 woes that actually were to follow, and that is a failure to worship God properly. The 2 latter woes focus on Israel's failure to love their neighbors. One cannot love his neighbor without first loving God. If they don't love God, they can't love their neighbor. We know that they probably didn't love God, certainly not to the extent that they needed to or should have, and therefore they didn't love their neighbors. Love and justice are really hallmarks of the man of God and the people of God. So if you claim to be God's, and especially in our Christian era, you claim to be a Christian, and you are not a person of love or justice, you need to take inventory. Without these characteristics, one cannot, in good faith, declare himself as a godly person. Because of this fact, God, I think, will judge harshly any nation that oppresses the poor and or does not mete out justice equally. There's a lot being said today about the way our justice system operates. While we like to think we have the greatest justice system in the world, that's not necessarily so. We have many examples of people being railroaded in our justice system. And until we as a society come to grips with that shortcoming and begin to mete out justice without regard for background, race, whatever, then God is not going to look upon us favorably. And now that being said, God, I think, will especially judge his own people. And by his own people, I mean the church. We must assure the world of our commitment to meeting social needs and administering social justice. Does that mean that we overlook the law of the land? No. I think the laws of the land are there for a reason, and they must not be violated under any condition. But we do need, when they are violated, we need to mete justice out equally. Now, the third woe continues this theme in chapter 6, verse 4. No doubt the wealthy in Israel were enjoying a life of luxury. Without regard for the needs all around them, they relished their lifestyle, never thinking about the poor. Didn't cross their minds. So wrapped up were they in their opulence and their stuff that they didn't even think of God. They were mostly concerned with satisfying their wants, and indulging their passions, and meeting their needs. So as a result of that self-centeredness, they would now become the first of those who would go into exile. We know that from chapter 6, verse 7. Now, Amos kind of concludes his book with a series of symbolic visions. This is not the ending verses, but it certainly is the ending segment. These are in chapter 7, 8, and in the first 10 verses of chapter 9. And what Amos is telling us there is that he sees a vision of locusts and a vision of fire, in both cases after first declaring, this will not happen. The Lord turns a deaf ear to the pleas of Amos to spare Jacob, to spare Israel. But he sees this vision of locusts and fire. But the final decision is not based upon the locusts and the fire with respect to destroying Israel. The final decision is based upon a third vision, that of a plumb line. Now, have any of you ever used a plumb line? I'm not a carpenter. I couldn't build anything that would stand up if I tried. But my father was a master carpenter. And when he died and I went through his belongings, he had obviously a large toolbox full of carpentry tools. One of the things that was in there was this heavy metal weight about this long, and it had a point on the end of it and a string attached to it. It was what he called a plumb bob. I don't know whether you call them a plumb bob today or not, but that's what he called it. It's a plumb line, and it's designed to set a straight line. It's used to measure the accuracy of a line. In this case, the purpose of the plumb line was to measure Israel by the standards of Yahweh. Having failed, God says, I will no longer spare them. And then appears Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, who speaks to Jeroboam against Amos in an effort to try to get rid of him. We don't need this guy, king. We need to get rid of him. He needs to go away. Something needs to be done about this vagrant who seems to be out in the streets, stirring up the people. And Jeroboam wants him to leave Israel and flee to Judah, where he can deliver his prophecies to somebody else, not in my backyard. But Amos refuses, not going to go anywhere, saying, I'm just a mere sheep herder. I'm just a simple keeper of the sycamore fig trees. But brave Amos delivers that decree of God anyway. He informs Jeroboam words that Jeroboam would never want to hear. He informs Jeroboam that his wife would become a harlot on the streets of Bethel, and his sons and daughters would meet their deaths by the sword. Someone would slay them. He even dared to tell Jeroboam that he would die not on his own home soil, but on pagan soil, out there somewhere, in a defiled land. Needless to say, Jeroboam was not a happy camper. But Amos had delivered the message. And then Amos had a fourth vision. He had 5 altogether, but then he had a fourth vision here. This vision is that of summer fruit. It's a symbol of the end that has finally come upon Israel. The time for summer fruit, as we all know, is quite short. I don't know about you, but I love when the summertime comes. It's the only time, especially in the early part of the summer, it's even shorter, when I can get Vidalia onions. And I love sweet Vidalia onions. If you've never had an onion sandwich made with a Vidalia onion, ooh, you don't know what it's like. Peaches. I love peaches. But the time for peaches is this late spring and summer, and it's short. Those times are quite short. So by him having this vision of summer fruit, he's picturing a graphic illustration of the short lifespan of the northern kingdom of Israel. We know that it eventually went away. Their dishonesty and their mistreatment of the poor have finally now caught up with them. So Amos prophesies that the sky will be darkened, feasts will be turned to mourning, and famine shall encompass the land. Not words anybody wants to hear. But then, Amos has yet a fifth vision, a final vision, similar to the previous 2 visions. This one pictures the complete destruction of an adulterated sanctuary in the northern kingdom of Israel, likely at Bethel. You will find references to this in chapter 3, verse 14, chapter 4, verse 4, chapter 5, verses 5 and 6, chapter 7, verse 10, and verse 13. The basic message of this particular vision is that none of those who flee will get away. Nobody will get away. None of the fugitives will escape. Just look at chapter 9, verse 1. As with all prophets, there were those who would not accept the words of Amos. They did not believe that God's judgment would come on their people. We are God's people. We are God's chosen people. We can do what we want and God will stay with us. No, that's really not quite true. My, how they were about to get a wake-up call. Wake-up call of all wake-up calls. This picture in chapter 9 reminds me of the image of Samson when he destroyed the pillars of the temple of the Philistines. Amos warns them, and now he envisions the very capitals of the columns falling on the heads of the worshipers. And those that were not killed by the falling stone are killed by the sword. There is no escape. And those who perchance survive the temple destruction and the sword will find captivity as their next fate. A doom and gloom prophecy. But then in chapter 9, verses 11 through 15, we have this epilogue which gives us a restoration under a Davidic king. Judgment is coming. But beyond that day of judgment is a day of blessing for Israel. These closing verses of Amos's prophecy bring hope as he speaks of the restoration of the Davidic line. And he's probably referring to the Messiah. I don't have any doubt that what he's referring to here is the Messiah. It's important to remember that Israel is God's chosen people. They indeed are God's chosen people. And he has not forsaken them. He won't forsake them. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 26. He said, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come to Israel until the full number of Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the liberator will come from Zion. He will turn away godlessness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Throughout the prophecy of Amos, it's easy to see his constant but unshakable message that God sees Israel's greatest sin and ours as well, and they will not go unpunished. Rather, the righteousness of God as declared in His Word will ultimately triumph. Israel was judged because of its economic injustice, because of its national idolatry. Not only Israel, but also the nations as well need to pay heed. We today need to pay heed. God's relationship with Israel was, I think, a witness to God's intent for the entire creation. All nations, including the United States, should listen, learn, and heed the message of Amos. God will begin to work with Israel once again as a nation. Amos 9, 11 through 15 looks beyond the time of God's blessing on the church to a future day of Jewish blessing. There is, after all, still a future age of blessing to come to Israel. And so concludes our study of Amos. Now, next week we will be looking at Obadiah, one of the short books of the minor prophets. I hope that you will join us for that. It only has 21 verses, but we can make a good 45-minute lesson out of it. So I hope that you'll join us again next week for our study of Obadiah. And you have a good day. Thank you for joining us.